Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second Climate Perspectives interview today. I'm delighted to welcome to my hot seat AECOM's Global Energy Advisory Lead, indeed Vice President for Global Energy Advisory, Adrian Maestro, who's going to talk about leadership in his sector and amongst wider audiences. Just by way of introduction, at AECOM, Adrian advises a portfolio of clients ranging from utilities, oil and gas companies to low carbon players, startups, and investors. And he covers a range of areas, including low carbon investments such as EV charging, hydrogen, carbon capture, energy security, ESG, and also navigating the energy transition. The energy transition, which was something that was widely discussed in the previous interview that I did with Xeon Lights just half an hour ago. As a result, of course, Adrian, I think, is well placed to discuss climate leadership and address some of the key questions facing us all. I'm going to be talking to Adrian in total for around about half an hour. Included within that is the opportunity for our audience to ask any questions. If you have any, please just post them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them in the time that we've got available. For those that don't know me, I'm Andy Walker. I'm an infrastructure and construction journalist and also a contributor to the aforementioned Climate Perspectives magazine as well. So, Adrian, good morning to you. You're very welcome to this special leadership interview. Why do you think leadership is so important in the battle to combat climate change?
Andy, thank you very much for inviting me. So why is leadership important in climate change? And I think there's probably two elements there. There's clearly an urgency angle, which I'll touch on briefly. And I think there's a big theme around the scale and the complexity, and I'll elaborate that shortly. So in terms of the urgency, I think we've seen it all in the last few months, the last year. We're seeing these frequent extreme weather events, the wildfires, extreme heat, droughts. It's really knocking on our door. And the number that keeps sticking in my mind is we need to reduce greenhouse gases by 42% by 2030, and we've got some way to go there. And when I talk about the scale, the pace, the complexity of the energy transition, if we let's talk about the complexity first. At the highest level, what we're trying to do is create a new low carbon energy system, ramp it up, while gradually scaling back the old legacy fossil fuel system. And while doing that, we're trying to manage energy security. And energy security, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine, that's been a prevalent theme across many, many, many governments. And that's quite a difficult juggling act. And if you think about it, just to bring it home, you think about it in the UK, we've got an offshore wind target of 50 gigawatts by 2030. And it took us about 10, 12 years to get from 1 gigawatt to 14 gigawatts where we are now. And we're going to have to increase that multiple times over the next 7 years. So on top of that logistical challenge of generating that offshore wind, we've got all the complications of making sure we've got the connections to transport those electrons from the offshore wind onto onshore and to the centers of demand. So lots of complexity. On the scale side, I mean, the two themes that I think, Andy, that really kind of resonate with me is the investment side, and just the sheer amount of infrastructure that needs to be built. And I'll take transmission and distribution as an example. So if we look at the investment side, we invest globally around about $1.8 trillion a year in clean energy. And that's a lot more than the 1.1 that's invested in fossil fuels. And that amount has been growing significantly over the last few years. So you're seeing lots of investment in clean tech, but we're going to probably have to at least treble that amount of investment to make sure that we're on track for that 1.5 degree pathway by 2030. On the transmission and distribution, and I'm talking about power there, that's really important because transmission and distribution is going to be the backbone to the transition in terms of making sure we've got that infrastructure to allow electrification. And if you look at transmission and distribution infrastructure, I think, according to the IEA, over the last 20 years, we've built around about 25 million kilometers of T&D infrastructure. Going forward by 2030, we're going to have to build about 80 million kilometers. And that's expansions, that's new build, replacement. So that's an enormous logistical effort that we're going to have to do. And if you think about the investment required just for that part of the value chain, the IEA talks about, I think the last few years have been fairly flat at about 300 billion euros a year spent on T&D in the power sector. It's going to have to double to 600 by 2030. So hopefully that gives you a flavor of that, the urgency and the complexity and the scale of what we need to do.
So there's a massive challenge there, clearly, and also a massive amount of money that's actually going to be needed. Obviously, that's a matter for the politicians, and we'll get to that later. But I think it's also a matter for our industry, for your industry, to highlight what's needed. So, from your perspective, in relation to that, in relation to, I suppose, informing and educating the politicians, what does good leadership look like from the sector in relation to that issue?
So it's a really good question. So I'm just going to broaden it a little bit because I think it's helpful, because when we talk about leadership from different groups, the way I look at the world is you've got some key stakeholders, which are basically governments, business, investors, and consumers. I'm not going to talk about all of them in detail, but I just want to give you a flavor. So for the governments, who have got a really important role, their role is to set the ambition, right? So they're the ones who set the net zero targets, the decarbonization targets. They're the ones that provide that regulatory framework that now allows investment to come in, capital innovation to be exploited. I think on the business side, businesses have really, I think, stepped up to the challenge. So if you think about the previous COPs to COP26, it was mostly led by governments setting that agenda. In COP26, for me, one of the most striking things about it was that you saw business step up there. And you see now business really leading in terms of decarbonizing their own businesses. And you're seeing a lot of cooperation between businesses. If you think of, for example, one of the first things that any corporate will do when it sets its net zero ambition is to look at its vehicle fleet, to decarbonize its vehicle fleet. Yeah, so trucks, cars, those kind of things, vans, right? And what was interesting is that you see a lot of these companies collaborating with each other, figuring out how to decarbonize their vehicle fleet. So you're seeing a lot of collaboration, and I think that's a really positive sign. I think that last group, the consumers, which is basically you and I and all our colleagues who are listening onto this webcast, their role is to hold us to account. So I think for me, the biggest change is you've got social media, you've got technology, people can influence governments, people can influence companies by simply expressing their views. And because of social media, you can get scale and speed in terms of getting that message out. So I think the role of consumers is really to hold us to account. The last part of that equation, I think, is partnerships. So I think what we've seen in the last few years are partnerships between government and business, and I think that's a really compelling proposition. And a really simple example of how that can be really powerful is if you again look at the creation of the offshore wind industry in the UK. We had a government that had an ambition to be an offshore leader. We had 0 gigawatts. They set up a regulatory framework which was all around the contracts for differences, and then you had the private sector come in with their capital, with their innovation, and then we are now at 14 gigawatts, second largest offshore wind player in the world, second only to China. And that's what happens when you're able to marry those two capabilities together. I think the other layer of partnership, which I alluded to with the EV decarbonization theme, is you're getting companies that partner with each other because the transition, the point that I made earlier, the scale, the complexity, it's very difficult for companies, particularly in the energy sector, to have all the in-house capabilities. So they partner with other companies. And those partnerships are to build capabilities for the transition. And it's also traditional partnership rationale. You syndicate the technical risk, you syndicate the financial risk. But you're seeing a lot of energy companies that you wouldn't necessarily see as natural partners. So think of oil and gas companies partnering with offshore wind developers to promote hydrogen, or energy companies working with digital companies to improve their digital capabilities. That's the power of partnerships.
So, obviously, commercial organisations working together is making a difference. One of the things that strikes me around this whole area is the changes that organizations have to make to the way they do business in order to, meet sustainability targets. And also, as you pointed out earlier, there's a lot more scrutiny now of what companies are doing. What is AECOM doing in this area? What have you had to change in the way that you kind of go about your business?
So great question, Andy. So let me just take it from the broader perspective of what's AECOM doing the energy transition, and then I can talk a little bit about what we're doing as an organization internally. So I think on the broader picture, we've focused very much on energy transition. It's a big focal point for the firm. And when we talk about energy transition, there are parts of the value chain that we're really going a deep dive. That's offshore wind, grid modernization, future fuels such as hydrogen and transport decarbonisation. And underpinning all of that is ESG. And we do a lot of work in, for example, helping offshore wind farms develop the kind of the permitting, the design, the engineering concept and design. And we're doing a lot of that in jurisdictions that are becoming frontier areas such as the US and Taiwan. We are helping, an interesting example, this is all in the public domain. There's a big US utility, San Diego Gas and Electric, and we're leading the program management for that utility to help them in the undergrounding of their cables to mitigate wildfire risks. We're also working with a number of companies that are promoting the development of green hydrogen, for example. There's one particular company that we're working with in Paraguay where they're using hydro to generate green hydrogen that's then used to produce green fertilizer. So lots of examples of the work that we're doing in the energy transition. Within our own organization, we're extremely conscious of our own carbon footprint. So we have a net zero goal. We're looking to reduce emissions, particularly scope 3. And we are extremely good at making everybody aware of the contributions they can make themselves in terms of trying to reduce their carbon footprint. Simple example, if you can do a conference call, do a conference call rather than jump on a plane. Yeah.
I mean, that's great. Martin's put a question in the chat, which I think is an interesting one, and that's how do we make production or services whilst emitting greenhouse gases more expensive than doing it without the emissions? So I think what he's saying there is how do we disincentivize people from using old methods and old methodologies and actually going down a greener route? Is there something in that? Is that something that can be done? Is it being done in your view?
So I think Martin's question, and I hope I've interpreted this correctly. I think there's an element of us changing our behaviors, the way we do things. I mean, just in the broadest sense, right? And that's quite a difficult thing to do. I mean, back to your earlier point about broadly, how do we decarbonize? Governments are setting the direction of travel. Businesses are looking to decarbonize. We're trying to ramp up all these low carbon sources. A lot of it is being driven by business and corporate. When I hear that question from Martin, I'm thinking that's the role of the consumer. And I think we all need to make choices about what we're going to do to contribute to reducing carbon. And that's quite a difficult, I think for some, that's quite a difficult decision-making process because, if you're used to traveling by plane all the time to going on your holidays with your family, it's quite a difficult thing to say, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do a staycation, for example. Some people are comfortable with that, some people are not. But I do think we're getting to a point in this journey where the urgency to mitigate our carbon footprint will require everybody to make sacrifices to some degree, and that's the only way we're gonna meet that goal at some point. Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm glad you've said that because one of the things I wanted to go on to talk about, and it came up in the previous conversation with Xeon Lights, and that is this kind of thing around individual responsibility, and we've all got to change what we do because I think it's fair to say that the government are playing with that a little bit at the moment. We saw it in some of the conversations around the ultra low emission zone. It's been highly politicized about, well, you shouldn't have to sort of go out of your way and change your life in order to save the planet, as it were. And I suppose it could be argued in that situation that shows a lack of leadership by our politicians. I mean, in your view, is the government doing enough on this issue, and how should it actually get people to a point where they're actually just doing the right thing, because it's not just because it's the right thing to do, because it's easy to do the right thing.
So very straightforward question, quite a complicated one to answer. And so I'm going to broaden it just in terms of not just the UK government, just broadly government. So I think we're reaching a point. This is quite a challenging period that we're going through, and one of the challenges, particularly for governments, is balancing affordability with decarbonisation, right? And this is not just a UK thing, right? So you've alluded to the UK with the deferral of the ice ban and the diluting of some of those decarbonisation heating policies. We're seeing a little bit of this happen in Canada, for example. The Canadian government there has just exempted for 3 years the carbon tax on people using oil heating, for example. And in Germany, another good example, they were looking to promote quite aggressively the ban of fossil fuel boilers for 2024. They got quite a lot of pushback. It's now pushed back to 2028. And the challenge is we're seeing this environment now, this business environment that we're all living with a cost of living crisis, cost inflation, high interest rates. There's a lot of pressure on consumers already. And put aside the politics of it, the transition is going to cost us. It costs us in terms of investment, costs us in terms of making difficult choices. Yeah. And I think some governments are reluctant or are, let's just say, extremely sensitive about that balance between affordability and decarbonisation. And they're having to weigh that up. And I think this is going to be an ongoing theme as well. So I think that just complicates things. But to your earlier point, at the end of the day, we're all individuals. We can all make choices. I think also just to kind of be aware that it's not just impacting governments, it's also impacting businesses as well. So I think a lot of these low carbon projects are high capital expenditure upfront. And the current environment, again, cost inflation, rising interest rates make it harder for a lot of these companies to get these projects off the ground. You've got compounded by issues such as strained supply chains. Offshore wind is a good example. But I do think just on that, from the business perspective, that's probably a good thing, because businesses are then forced to filter out their projects and really focus on the ones that are the more bankable ones, the ones that are more economically feasible. So I think out of this difficult situation that we're having to navigate, I still see opportunities for us to advance the transition.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned offshore wind there, because there's an interesting question from Stuart in the chat. He's raised the issue of the contract for differences auction for this year, and he's saying, what are your views on the fact that no offshore wind bids were put forward? Did the government drop the ball? Is the wind industry looking for profits that are too high? Discuss.
Yes, very good. That's a kind of a great tabloid question that would be good in an A-level exam. So I see where the gentleman's coming from. So I think with the UK auction, it wasn't a surprise to the energy sector that there were not going to be any offshore wind bids, simply because the economics didn't stack up. And I suspect the government will probably take some lessons for that, and we'll try and address that in the next auction. The bigger theme is you're seeing distress across elements of that offshore wind value chain. And you will have noticed that, for example, you're seeing some projects getting put on hold because of the economics. In the US, there are some developers that are choosing to pay penalty fees to exit from existing agreements. There are other developers that are incurring impairments for delayed projects, and these are significant amounts. There's an offshore wind developer that I think they're likely to accrue $4 to $5 billion worth of impairment. Some of the energy majors are accruing hundreds of millions of dollars of impairments. And part of this is the fact that you've seen 40% increase in costs, and they're having to kind of deal with that. Part of it is the nature of these projects. This kind of long time, it takes quite a long time to get some of the permitting out the way. There are issues around the supply chain that I've alluded to, but simply there are not enough vessels to get the kit out to sea and erect them in situ. And I think all these issues are beginning to kind of converge. Now, I just want to be super clear about this. This is not the end of the sector. I think this is a blip. You're seeing a supply chain, a nascent supply chain grow, and there are some challenges with that supply chain. And I think historically, some of those supply chains were not the most commercially focused. I think they're beginning to come more commercially focused. Offshore wind is going to be another one of those backbones of the energy transition. So we need it, and it will grow, and it will be extremely successful. I think it's just going through what I describe as growing pains right now. And back to the original caller's comment there, I think just another broad point. I think one of the things that governments need to really ensure is that the regulatory regime, so contracts for differences or Inflation Reduction Act in the US, these are all examples, they need to be stable and predictable. What investors don't like is unpredictability. If they're going to deploy capital, they need to know that the government is behind that investment for the long term and will do everything possible to stabilize that regulatory regime.
Thanks for that, Adrian. I actually just want to kind of come on to the industry, the sector that you kind of work in, which is obviously crucial to delivering on sustainability targets, net zero emissions, all of it really. Do you think that the role and the necessity of good infrastructure, which obviously does and can cause a lot of the emissions that we face, is that well understood in society and also by opinion formers and the politicians? What's your view on that?
Great question. So when you say infrastructure, just to be clear, I'm thinking energy infrastructure. So let's just make it very
I'm
clear.
talking, because I'd like to think that I'm an advocate for infrastructure. I consider infrastructure to be everything, including housing, by the way. We haven't got time to have a separate conversation about housing, but for me, housing, places, that's infrastructure as well. So the whole kit and caboodle, the built environment, is it clearly enough understood the absolutely central role that all of that plays on this issue?
Yeah, okay, fine. So in its broadest sense, I think probably the biggest thing is education. I just think we cannot assume that people understand all the ramifications. So we need to educate everyone on, what are the source of these emissions? What can we do to mitigate them? And probably the most important thing is, what are the trade-offs? Yeah. I think a good example, and sorry, I need to bring it back to energy because I think it's just helpful to give concrete examples. If you think about the need for the build out of transmission and distribution grid in a number of countries in Europe, of which I think 40% of the grid is over 40 years old, so that it needs to be upgraded. A lot of that will require stakeholder engagement, and it means talking to individuals, people living in the cities, people living in the towns, about what's happening, what are the implications, why are we doing that, and what are the trade-offs. That famous NIMBY phrase, that kind of attitude will not help us in enabling the transition. And it comes back to the very first, I think your very first caller's comment about individual sacrifice, individual commitments. We're all going to have to make some kind of trade-off. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to deliver this transition.
Sorry, Adrian, but isn't part of helping people to make those decisions, make it easier to make those decisions, is putting the infrastructure in place, whether that be the actual physical infrastructure, including the regulatory regime, all of that? Isn't it part of good leadership on behalf of the government and the people who are making these decisions to actually put that stuff in place? And I suppose in some ways, I'm not trying to put words into your mouth, stop playing politics with this issue and take a look at the longer term and say, right, this is what we need to do. Surely that's good leadership, and our politicians should be doing it, shouldn't they?
So I'm going to stay well clear of the politicians, Andy. And I just think it is incumbent on all of us, back to those groupings that I mentioned, governments, businesses, investors, consumers. It's on all of us to understand this is the challenge we have. This is what we need to do in order to decarbonize our society. And there will be trade-offs and there will be sacrifices, but we need to do that because we need to build a sustainable future.
Okay. Drawing things to a close a little bit. In my first interview, I had a very interesting conversation with Xeon Lights about young people and also where they were going in all of this. And I think she came out with a quote that if you want to make a difference and if you want to really change things in this area, then you should be working in this sector. You mentioned earlier about capacity and resources in relation to offshore wind. We know that there is a skills and resources gap in our sector as a whole, in the infrastructure sector. Do you think that gap is an impediment to combating climate change? In other words, have we got the right people in the right places? And what more can we do to make the sector even more attractive, to say to those new people, and particularly young people, if you want to change the world, you need to come and work for AECOM, for example?
Yeah, so I'm going to do it in reverse order. So I'm going to deal with your youth point and then the capabilities. So on the youth point, yes, big time. We need the young are our generation of the future, and they're the ones that are going to help us deliver this in terms and hold us to account and deliver it. And I think the other thing is, I think the younger generation, they just bring a diversity of thinking that's really critical. So yes, please, for all companies that are looking to decarbonize, that are playing a role in the decarbonization, I think one of their biggest challenges and opportunities is how do you draw that younger talent in and build up that capability. On the bigger point of capability building, it's probably the biggest bottleneck to the energy transition that is the least understood and the least recognized outside the energy sector. So I think capabilities, bringing in the right talent within organizations is a huge challenge, right? We need not just more engineers, but we need more digital software programmers, data scientists. You need a different capability set. And I think there's a big challenge, there's a big opportunity. So the IEA talks about 14 million new jobs globally on the back of a net zero scenario, which is great. But the reality is we need more of those capabilities now, and there is a shortfall. There's a nice example I saw, I think in France, they're looking to create a hydrogen economy in France by 2030, and they estimate that they will need 100,000 new jobs, and there's no way they're going to be able to deliver that. And therefore, you're going to have to bring in new talent, and you have to figure out, what's the value proposition of your firm to draw that talent in and retain them. You have to look at where you have existing talent that needs to be reskilled and redeployed. So there's a number of ways that you can do it, but clearly there is a bottleneck, and we need to address that in order to enable that the transition happens.
Okay, so notwithstanding all of those challenges, and there are obviously challenges that the industry, working with partners and government, can actually do something about. Are you optimistic about the future? And why should we be optimistic about the future?
So yes, I am optimistic about the future, and I think that we have most of everything we need in order to deliver the transition. So we got capital that we already discussed. We broadly have the capabilities. We just need more of it. We have the innovation. I think we're making enormous progress. If you look at adoption of electric vehicles globally, the sales of those electric vehicles are improving more and more. We're seeing a greater penetration of renewables across the globe globally. I think it was something like 500 gigawatts of new renewable capacity additions that will be in this year, which is all extremely encouraging. And even if you look at some of the large emitters, they're doing stuff that probably they're not getting enough recognition. If you look at China, which I think is the biggest emitter of carbon emissions, 31%, they are the biggest investor globally in renewables. They've got more than half of the electric vehicle stock in the world. So they're making changes there. The US, I think, is the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, the investment that's drawn something like over $200 billion to date, and the investment that continues to flow to enable the transition. These are all positive indicators. So the direction of travel is clear. We're making progress, and arguably significant progress. We just need to do more. So very, very positive in terms of the outlook.
Adrian, we've run out of time. I knew it'd go by really quickly. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Adrian Del Maestro, Global Energy Advisory Lead at AECOM. Really appreciate your time with us today. So thanks for taking part. Coming up next, starting at 11 a.m., we've got our second leadership interview, and that's going to be with Tom Burke, who is co-founder and chair of the climate change think tank, no less, E3G. So to join that session again, just stay online with the link and we'll be back after a short break. We'll see you at 11 a.m.